Okay, so part three of this week's content is looking at the work of Peter Kelly and Artefacts of Expertise. So I think Kelly's work from the early 2000s is particularly important and foundational for what youth studies is. It basically asks us to and encourages us to think about, what are the interventions into young people's lives? What are they actually doing? Um, all these experts and all this knowledge that we have about young people, is it actually making their lives better, or is it we just having these kind of interventions in their lives to discipline them and control them? So Kelly's work is drawing upon Foucault, particularly notions of discourse, governmentality, the biopolitics and technologies of the self. And he argues, through the lens of those concepts that basically young people are structurally positioned in positions of institutionalized mistrust. He basically argues, I suppose, that risk itself becomes the lens that young people are viewed through. And kind of risk pretty much colors the way that adults think of young people. In those figurative ways, I suppose, that I touched on in the previous part of the lecture. So these kind of risky anxieties about young people that kind of tap into notions of the future, tap into notions of how the economy works, tap into all kinds of different notions of inequalities and adulthood and these kind of things. The question becomes how can we manage these risks, i.e. these young people, to make those kind of things, politics, economics, labour markets, better, rather than the other way around. Essentially, this means it's kind of the cart's being put before the horse. Individuals and young people as a group are being blamed for these kind of structural problems that they have no control over. So they're put under the surveillance, their lives are intervened and regulated in all kinds of contradictory ways. So in this framework, there's a kind of governmentality at play here, that much of the kind of orientation towards young people is relying on definitions and problems created by experts, including youth sociologists. And this segments the youth cohort into kind of greater spotlight for regulation and control compared to kind of older adults. Importantly here, knowledge is a key form of this discipline. As all those disciplines that I was mentioning earlier, like economics and psychology and social work and sociology and all these things, do research and know more and more about young people's lives, the more they therefore are controlled to discipline relate to that knowledge, the more they can be controlled. And you can see how this echoes Foucault's work, previously about, the discursive regimes around homosexuality and the like. So in this sense, young people become an artifact of expertise. They're to be shaped, molded, inculcated, helped, fixed, protected, rather than, I suppose, just allowed to develop themselves and, be in the world. Generationally speaking, some of the kind of work around this argues that this is kind of happening more and more than previous times. The idea that kind of young people are more free to, misbehave, back behind the bike sheds or out in public and all that kind of stuff, less walking to work and walking to school and all this kind of thing now, where their lives are more controlled, the helicopter parent and stuff like that, all become a kind of part of this discourse as well. So, much as Peter kind of talks about, much of the generalized institutional anxieties about young people are about them making a successful transition to adulthood. And again, we come back to these kind of tensions between, are young people ever going to grow up and take responsibility and like work hard enough to buy a house or whatever? Or are they kind of, being exposed to risks early and early, and we need to protect them and, helicopter parent them and all that kind of stuff. So they're both then seen as kind of at risk and risk taking, relating to all those kind of tensions I was talking about in part 2 of the lecture. So this kind of relates again to notions of risk society and the way that kind of young people are seen as ungovernable. They're lacking in self-regulation. They take too many risks, and we need to intervene in their lives to make them better, to make them adults. So this ends up in a bunch of risk management practices, concerns about youth, the dangers and risks. So they're under kind of more and more surveillance and coercion, under more regulations. And, this has potentially negative impacts, particularly when young people is deemed to be at risk and labelled at risk, and they tend to therefore have interventions in their lives from various authority figures. That labelling itself, as Howard Becker has shown, for many decades can therefore become part of their own identity. This therefore can fundamentally change their lives. Importantly here, what this kind of focus on risk and this focus on regulation means is that there's actually more money spent on kind of managing risks and managing these kind of interventions than maximizing young people's potential. So this actually has real effects on the way that money's spent in schools or in the human services or whatever, around that, like protecting young people or regulating them or intervening in their lives, rather than setting up circumstances where they can kind of have opportunities. What this relates to as well is the way that then this notion of risk factors are used, and this kind of risk factorology in a way where, like, there's all these kind of lists on a kind of checklist that if you tick off means that a young person will be at risk of kind of not becoming that kind of coherent adult. Many of these risk factors seem to just look a lot about stuff that happens in that rite of passage from being a child to adult. As young people move out from the family home and kind of engage with the world, they, you know, are exposed to a bunch of different things where they have to make decisions and learn and do things that look like taking risks, but really just in more ways than one are just a kind of way of growing up. So the other way of critiquing this as well is many of the things on that list apply to, like, more and more kids than ever before, particularly around, you know, disorders and attention difficulties and all that kind of stuff. Academic failure, for instance, there, you know, I fundamentally horribly failed the HSC. I think I got something like 42 or whatever the TER, I think it was called back then. And it's like not a marker of failure for the rest of your life. So again, getting some of these risk factors ticked don't necessarily lead to this kind of failure or problems or risks. They're just kind of often a part of growing up and making mistakes and failing and learning and maybe doing better later on. So what the critique here kind of then moves to is the idea that much of these interventions aren't necessarily about making the lives of young people better, making them happier, making them more satisfied. It's more about, as I've said in the previous part of the lecture, ensuring that they're like better students, going to be regular workers, flexible workers. What relates to Foucault's work is kind of producing this kind of docile adults that kind of Goofy there represents. So this kind of relies heavily on this kind of probabilistic form of thinking, that if you kind of do these things now, you're going to end up being this other thing later on. So again, the interventions here are couching the language that's for young people's own good, but a kind of more ideological critique of this would kind of think about how it's kind of seems to be more good for the economy or the labour market. And that's increasingly problematic today, you know, 15, 20 years after Kelly's original work was published, in that the labour market is ever more casualised and uncertain today, and like blaming people for kind of not doing well in the labour market is absurd when there's actually kind of very few full-time secure jobs anymore. So much of this then becomes, you know, the kind of that for your own good about governing through freedom. This idea that kind of we're intervening on life to make your life better, but really the idea here is more about, you know, making you more of a good worker, a good consumer. Much of the work here tends to therefore pathologize certain young people, certain groups of young people, whether individually or in subcultures or, you know, that do specific practices as dangerous. It means that there's kind of a growing kind of human services sector, which is definitely good for probably many people in this degree and in this subject that are kind of studying that area. But it doesn't necessarily, you know, lead to kind of more positivity in young people's lives. As Kelly argues, these interventions from youth workers, truant officers, police, teachers, careers advisors, academics will not necessarily improve their lives. At the same time that there's more experts making interventions into young people's lives, and relating back to kind of the notion of policy and public spending here, less money is spent on, you know, actual providing things for young people to do, you know, outside of things like, you know, work for the dole and juvenile justice and stuff like that. Closing down youth venues everywhere, of course, they're not seen as profitable, or they're closed for safety reasons, because, you know, there's actual young people congregating in those spaces. You know, a youth venue will kind of often be in a city where there's kind of departments building around, and the NIMBYs there won't want to have any of that stuff around. So they'll complain about it and these things get shut down. So managing risk here often isn't necessarily therefore about managing the risk to young people's lives. It's often about managing property prices or, public space. Ironically, where many young people want to be and kind of are in that liminal space in terms of rites of passage and learning how to be in the world. So young people in this broad sense, and this relates back again to one of the figures in terms about being politically revolutionary and like protesting and stuff like that. This has resonances as young people are kind of ungovernable. They're seen as kind of risky. And we need to kind of mold them from this ungovernable, undeveloped state into this kind of governable, developed adult. Now, as many of you will know, you probably know lots of kind of ungovernable, risky, kind of bad choice-making adults. It's kind of this linear transition of kind of cognitive development and making good choices seems to map on more to kind of problems around inequalities than it does to kind of this kind of age brackets. So the critique here about this kind of mainstream model is that much of this kind of work, these interventions, is about requiring young people to be molded into self-regulating citizens in terms of, what the capitalist demands are. Risks and things that are kind of defined as risk are anything that kind of challenges that successful transition, that successful kind of capitalist model of being a good worker. So this ungovernability, therefore, seems to map on to where young people are developing their own kind of understanding and way through the world, in much of the kind of learning and making choices and that kind of rite of passage stuff. And it's increasingly, normal things in that kind of transitional state are seen as risks and risk factors and become defined as those things. So importantly here, Kelly argues that young people become what he calls artifacts of expertise, constantly under more and more forms of surveillance and intervention, and in this position of what he calls institutionalized mistrust. I think those two terminologies are really important ways to kind of think about what youth studies is for, and how youth studies sometimes can be a problem in producing those things as well, and youth studies therefore needs to be reflexively critical of that. What's ironic here, I suppose, is that, most young people end up as kind of reasonably well-behaved adults in the end anyway, despite these interventions or despite ticking off many of these risk factors. So this institutionalized mistrust seems to therefore be increasingly, or more disproportionately, I should say, applied along race, class, and gender lines. It's it would be no surprise that like risk factors tend to cluster around working class kids, Indigenous kids, and migrant kids. So we can then think about the more kind of structural inequalities of how these kind of institutions work, who they put their gaze on, who they try and control, who they're trying to discipline. It means, therefore, that like in terms of thinking about youth as a kind of general category, the forensic gaze of these kind of experts tend to focus on marginalized youth. And therefore, as a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy here, that gaze therefore produces more risk definitions, and that's applied to these groups at a greater rate than those without it. So these risk management strategies and interventions are experienced really differently by different groups of young people. More privileged kids, particularly in private schools and stuff like that, tend to have these kind of opportunities funded for them, whether it's the, have a drama classes and tutors, or whether they have like rowing and kayaking at their schools, or, good sporting grounds. Less so for poorer schools, for instance, that don't have any of those things. So again, you can see how risk factors are therefore clustered around opportunity more so than kind of young people generally. Okay, I'm going to leave that there for this week's content. Thanks.